Next case, the voice boomed sharp and self-important, cutting through the stale air of the municipal courtroom. Docket 734, Silas Croft, failure to yield. As an old man rose slowly from the wooden bench, his movements deliberate, each one seeming to carry the weight of a century. Wearing a threadbare tweed jacket over a faded flannel shirt, his trousers impeccably creased but worn thin at the knees, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, a testament to seasons of sun and hardship. Yet his eyes were clear and steady, holding a placid depth that seemed to absorb the room's harsh fluorescent light without reflecting any of it back. And he approached the defendant's lectern, his posture unnaturally straight, a ramrod spine in a body that time had otherwise tried to bend, as Judge Albright, barely 30 and wearing his black robe like a suit of unearned armor, peered down from his elevated throne and scanned the citation with a sneer at the corners of his lips, saying with dripping condescension, "Mr. Croft, you're 93 years old. The citation says you drove straight through a four-way stop. At your age, perhaps the privilege of driving is one we should reconsider." While the old man, Silas, remained silent, simply placing his gnarled hands on the edges of the lectern, his knuckles white, his stillness not one of defiance but of profound patience, as if he were waiting for a storm to pass, until Albright pressed again, his voice rising. "Did you hear me, old man? I asked you a question. This is a courtroom. You are required to show respect. You are required to answer." And Silas's gaze did not waver as his voice finally came, raspy but calm like stones rolling in a slow river. "I heard you," the two words hanging in the air devoid of apology or fear, their simplicity infuriating the young. Judge Yu slammed his gavel with a sharp crack echoing in the silent room, and snapped that insolence would not be tolerated and that Silas would address him as Your Honor and explain his reckless behavior or admit the rules of civilized society were too taxing to follow. The tirade a performance of dominance for the handful of people scattered in the pews, traffic offenders, board clerks, and one young man in the back row whose posture was as rigid as the old man's at the front. Corporal Michael Evans, USMC, retired, who had come to contest a parking ticket, but whose attention was now fixed on the quiet drama unfolding before the bench because he had seen that stance before. The bearing of a man drilled to stand at attention until his bones fused. A man who had learned to absorb verbal assaults like a sandbag absorbed shrapnel with silent, unyielding density. While Albright continued his lecture, his words a cascade of legal jargon and thinly veiled insults about civility and public endangerment, declaring the laws of the city the bedrock of the community, not suggestions or optional guidelines to be ignored, but the fabric of order that Silas's actions had torn. As Silas's expression remained unchanged, his face a stoic mask, yet Evans saw the slight, almost imperceptible shift in the old man's shoulders and the fractional lift of his chin. Not arrogance but an ingrained reflexive bracing he had seen in recruits being screamed at by drill instructors, their bodies locked while their minds retreated to inner fortitude. And Albright, mistaking this composure for disrespect, grew even more agitated and threatened to hold Silas in contempt of court. A threat that would have made most people tremble, but elicited nothing as Silas merely blinked slowly and deliberately, drawing Evans further in as he realized he was no longer watching a stubborn old man but a soldier. The certainty settling deep in his gut from the economy of motion, and the deep abiding calm in the face of a lesser man's fury. A language Evans understood from the old gunnery sergeants at Paris Island. Men as ancient and immovable as mountains who had seen things that would break a man like Judge Albright in half. And as Evans's eyes scanned the worn jacket for a sign to validate his instinct, he saw it pinned to the lapel, almost hidden in the faded tweed. A small tarnished piece of metal, no bigger than a dime shaped, like a simple five-pointed star, so dull it barely caught the light. Meaningless to anyone else, but to Evans, a student of military history and obscure marine lore. It stirred a distant memory from a grainy black and white photograph in a dusty book about the chosen reservoir. Not a Medal of Honor, not a Navy Cross or a Silver Star, but something else entirely. And as he strained to remember, the judge's voice hammered on with the rhythmic cracking of the gavel, until one sharp crack struck Silas not as wood on wood, but as something else entirely, dissolving the courtroom for a fleeting second as the scent of floor polish and old paper became cordite and frozen mud. The droning voice turned into the distant thump of an enemy machine gun. Phantom cold bit into his fingers with a pain he hadn't truly felt in 70 years. And then he blinked and the courtroom swam back into focus with Judge Albright's face red and jaw clenched. The moment of dislocation passed, but leaving behind a ghost. A tremor in the old man's soul that only he could feel. Next case was called as the sharp, self-important voice cut through the stale air of the municipal courtroom, announcing docket 734, Silas Croft, failure to yield. And an old man slowly rose from the wooden bench with deliberate movements that seemed to carry the weight of a century. Wearing a threadbare tweed jacket over a faded flannel shirt, his trousers impeccably creased but worn thin at the knees, his face a roadmap of wrinkles shaped by seasons of sun and hardship. Yet his eyes were clear and steady, with a placid depth that absorbed the harsh fluorescent light without reflecting it back as he approached the defendant's lectern with an unnaturally straight posture. A ramrod spine in a body time had tried to bend, while Judge Albright, barely 30 and wearing his black robe like unearned armor, peered down from his elevated throne, scanned the citation with a sneer, and spoke with condescension about Silas being 93 and driving straight through a four-way stop, suggesting that at his age the privilege of driving should be reconsidered. As Silas remained silent with his gnarled hands on the edges of the lectern, his knuckles white, his stillness not one of defiance but of profound patience, as if waiting for a storm to pass, prompting Albright to press him angrily and demand respect and an answer, to which Silas calmly replied, "I heard you," the simple words hanging in the air without apology or fear, and infuriating the young judge, who slammed his gavel and accused him of insolence before unleashing a lecture of legal jargon and thinly veiled insults about public endangerment and tearing the fabric of order. While in the back row, Corporal Michael Evans, USMC retired, originally there for a parking ticket, watched with intense focus and recognized the bearing of a man trained to absorb verbal assault with silent, unyielding density. Noticing the slight shift in Silas's shoulders and the fractional lift of his chin that signaled ingrained bracing rather than arrogance, as Albright mistook this composure for stubbornness and threatened contempt of court, eliciting only a slow blink from Silas. And Evans's certainty hardened that he was watching a soldier as his eyes scanned the old man's worn jacket and found a small tarnished five-pointed star pinned to the lapel, dull and nearly hidden in the faded tweed, which to anyone else would look like a cheap trinket, but to Evans, a student of military history, stirred a distant memory of something rare and unofficial. While the rhythmic crack of the gavel briefly dissolved the courtroom for Silas into the phantom sounds of enemy machine gun fire, the smell of cordite and frozen mud, and a cold pain in his fingers from 70 years passed before the room swam back into focus and left only a ghostly tremor in his soul that Evans caught as a flicker in his eyes. The 1,000-yard stare that confirmed Silas was not entirely in that room. As Albright, having exhausted his indignation, moved to sentencing with theatrical gravity and declared a fine insufficient before sentencing him to 100 hours of community service, then coolly specifying the Northside Youth Reformatory boot camp program and whispering that real discipline might remind him how to follow orders, thick humiliation filling the room as a bailiff chuckled, and Silas's face remained a stone tablet, while Evans felt the injustice like a physical blow, and a surge of protective anger. Knowing he could not let this stand as the image of the tarnished star burned in his mind, and the silent code of brotherhood screamed at him to act. So as the judge dictated the final terms, Evans discreetly slipped out his phone and frantically searched Korean War Rare Star Medal, Chosen Reservoir Field Award, General's Personal Valor Pin. Growing frustrated until adding the word prototype led him to a digitized military history journal from the 1980s with a grainy photograph identifying the pin as the Shepherd Star, a field expedient award forged from scrap metal and personally given by Major General Oliver P. Smith during the brutal winter of 1950 to only a handful of men whose valor demanded immediate honor. With only 5 ever awarded and all believed killed in action shortly after, causing Evans's heart to hammer as he realized the man at the lectern was not just a veteran, but a living legend. And he quickly called the Quantico Public Affairs Office, urgently identifying himself as Corporal Michael Evans, retired, explaining that a 93-year-old man named Silas Croft in a Northwood, Virginia courtroom might be wearing a Shepherd Star, only to be met with skepticism that no known recipients were alive. Until after a longer pause and the distant clatter of a keyboard, the staff sergeant finally asked him to discreetly get a picture of the man, and the pin. Court was dismissed with a final triumphant bang of Judge Albright's gavel as he ordered the bailiff to escort Mr. Croft to the clerk's office and ensure he understood the terms of his education. And the burly young bailiff, puffed up with borrowed authority, stepped forward and grabbed Silas's upper arm with a grip of control and ownership, sneering, "Let's go, Grandpa." And the instant his fingers closed around Silas's bicep, the 70 years separating the courtroom from the frozen hell of the Kai Mountains vanished as the pressure on his arm became the desperate clutch of Private First Class Jimmy Kidd Riley, his face a mask of blood and shock, his legs shattered by machine gun fire, whispering, "Don't leave me, Sarge. Don't leave me." And Silas did not flinch or pull away, but recoiled inward as his pale blue eyes for one terrifying second lost their placid calm and became windows into fire and ice, all of which Evans saw from the back as the flicker of agony and the ghost of battle flared in the old man's gaze. And as the bailiff began to tug him forward, Evans raised his phone, aimed and clicked, capturing a blurry image of the stoic face, rigid posture, and the glint of the tarnished star on the lapel, sending it instantly to Staff Sergeant Williams, whose reply came back at once, no longer patient or skeptical, but a single urgent command in capital letters. "Acknowledge, stand by, do not let that man leave the building. A general officer is en route. ETA 7 minutes. Sending a chill through Evans as he realized a general officer was coming for a parking ticket dispute in a municipal court. And he stood up with his chair scraping loudly as he called out to the judge, who turned back in irritation before a low rumble began to permeate the old courthouse, growing into a deep, guttural vibration that resonated through the floorboards and rattled the tall windows. Clearly not city traffic, but the synchronized thrum of heavy-duty engines. Drawing every head in the courtroom to the windows where 2 immaculate black SUVs screeched to a halt, flanking a black staff car with a crisp 2-star flag on its fender. And the courtroom doors were thrown open with such force they slammed against the stoppers as 2 men in Marine Corps dress blues, jackets heavy with ribbons and white caps stark against the dim hallway, entered and took position on either side of the entrance with lethal, practiced grace that made the local bailiff look like a child playing dress-up. Between them, a Marine captain strode into the room, his eyes sweeping the scene with cold, analytical precision as his gaze passed over the stunned judge and the confused bailiff before finally locking onto Silas Croft, to whom he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The captain marched directly to the bench, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows in the deadly silent room as he stopped and looked up at Judge Albright, who was frozen halfway out of his chair, and said without warmth or deference, "Judge Albright, I am Captain Miller, United States Marine Corps. You will return to your seat," declaring that the court was now under the jurisdiction of a military command inquiry. At which Albright gaped in confusion and outrage and demanded under what authority. Only to be cut off as the captain stated, it was under the authority of Major General James Mallister, who was about to enter the room. And as if on cue, a third figure appeared in the doorway. A man in his late 50s with a uniform that testified to a lifetime of service and a constellation of medals glittering on his chest. His presence filling the room and sucking the very air from it. This being General Mallister, who ignored everyone else and fixed his sharp, intelligent eyes solely on the frail old man in the threadbare tweed jacket as he walked forward with a purpose that was both reverent and furious. His path cleaving the room in two, causing the arrogant bailiff, who still had a hand on Silas's arm, to recoil as if from fire and stumble backward in raw fear. After which the general stopped a foot before Silas, and for a moment the decorated commander and the silent old man simply looked at one another before the general's stern expression softened into profound respect, and he slowly turned his head to sweep the courtroom and finally lock onto the pale, trembling judge, his voice carrying the cold fire of command, as he declared that the room had become a place of dishonor and that the court had chosen to humiliate a man of dignity. Stepping closer as he condemned the judge for presuming to teach discipline to a man who embodied it, his voice dropping like ice as he announced he would now conduct a real re-education, before turning his back on the judge in ultimate dismissal and addressing the room as he unfolded an official document and announced that the man they dismissed as an old citizen was Sergeant Silas Croft of the United States Marine Corps, a veteran of the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, reading in a powerful cadence the citation for conspicuous gallantry as Silas's eyes grew distant with memory. The general adding details the citation failed to capture: the brutal cold, the overwhelming odds, the wounds already suffered, explaining how Silas had shielded a fallen Marine with his own body for over an hour under machine gun fire, absorbing 7 direct hits and saving his brother. Then pointing to the tarnished star on Silas's lapel as the Shepherd Star awarded on the battlefield by a general later killed in action. Folding the paper before saluting Silas with thunderous respect as the Marines behind him snapped to attention in perfect unison, shattering the courtroom shame while Judge Albright stood ashen and broken, his authority laid bare as hollow. The general finally declaring the court adjourned, the citation expunged, and a formal complaint filed with the Judicial Review Board, before gently telling Silas they were there to take him home. To which Silas responded with a quiet nod of weary understanding, later pausing only once to acknowledge Corporal Evans with a silent passing of respect, before walking out into the sunlight surrounded by Marines, leaving behind a courtroom forever marked by honor and justice.